You are about to cross into a world where fear is real. Real stories, unexplained phenomena, where the supernatural lurks in the shadows. From the portal of dread.
Today's story, the terrifying truth of the Chapel of the Huesos of Évora. I have been waiting for you. Welcome to my domain, the Portal of Dread. Here, each story is not merely a tale, but a portal I open directly to your worst nightmares. With me, fear is not just told, it is felt in the soul. Turn off the light. Lock the door. Let your own breath guide you through the inevitable labyrinth of madness. If you possess the foolish courage to cross this threshold, subscribe to the channel. And to prove your insolence, type in the comments, "I am not afraid." Now, prepare yourself, the unknown is already here. Welcome everyone to the Portal of Dread, where every story is a passage to your worst nightmares. Here, fear is not just told, it is experienced. Turn off the light, lock the door, and let your breath guide you through the maze of madness. If you have the courage to cross the threshold, subscribe to the channel and type, "I am not afraid" in the comments. Now, prepare for the unknown. There are places in the world where time does not heal wounds. Places where death has left scars so deep in reality that the veil between worlds has become as translucent as corpse skin. The Church of St. Francis in Évora, Portugal, is one of these cursed places. Its walls don't just hold history, they breathe with the sighs of 5,000 souls who never found peace. It was a September afternoon when Cleide Santos first set foot in the church's courtyard of uneven stones. The air was still, as thick as clotted blood, and even under the Portuguese sun, an inexplicable chill rose from the ancient stones and coiled around her ankles like hungry fingers. At 59, Cleide had visited dozens of historical sites around the world, but she had never felt anything like this. As if 1,000 invisible eyes were watching her through slits in the fabric of reality. Joceir Mendes, her travel companion, walked beside her with hesitant steps. At 62, the businessman was usually the skeptic of the group, the one who found logical explanations for every strange phenomenon they encountered. But today, his hands trembled imperceptibly, and his eyes avoided fixing on the church towers for more than a few seconds. There was something he hadn't told Cleide. Something about blood, about bones, about an ancestral debt on which time had charged compound interest for more than 4 centuries. The facade of the Church of St. Francis rose before them like a stone sentinel, its Gothic towers piercing the sky like claws trying to scratch the belly of paradise. Built in the 13th century, the structure had witnessed centuries of prayers, tears, whispered confessions, and above all, deaths. Many deaths. Deaths that left spectral echoes ingrained in the stones like bloodstains that no rain can ever completely wash away. Cleide adjusted the camera around her neck, unaware that each click of the shutter would capture much more than medieval architecture. In a few hours, those images would reveal faces that shouldn't exist, shadows that moved independently of their sources, and eyes that glowed in the empty sockets of centuries-old skulls. Eyes that would recognize Joceir instantly. The tour guide, a thin man of 40 with scars on his hands he never fully explained, approached them with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Welcome to the Church of St. Francis," he said, his voice carrying a Portuguese accent heavy with melancholy. "I hope you are prepared for a transformative experience." There was something in the way he pronounced transformative that made Cleide's stomach clench like a dying flower. As the guide spoke about the building's history, Joceir felt a growing pressure behind his eyes, as if someone were trying to force buried memories to the surface of his consciousness. Memories that belonged to him, yet also didn't. Memories of bonfires, of screams muffled by hoods, of bones being torn from sacred graves to serve as macabre ornaments in the name of a purification that never came. The entrance to the Chapel of Bones was at the back of the church, protected by a heavy wooden door that creaked like breaking bones when opened. Above the entrance, carved in stone with letters that seemed to have been sculpted with tears and blood, were the words that would serve as a prophecy for the next moments of their lives. "We bones that are here, for yours we wait." Cleide felt a shiver run down her spine, like the cold fingers of a dead child. "What a strange phrase for a church," she murmured, not realizing her voice had come out as an involuntary whisper, as if some force were preventing her from speaking at a normal volume in that sacred and cursed place. Joceir didn't answer. He couldn't, because in that moment as he read those words, a female voice echoed in his mind with the terrifying clarity of a deathbed confession. "You have finally returned, blood of my blood. You have finally returned to pay the price of forgetfulness." It was the voice of his great-great-grandmother, a woman who had died 300 years before he was born. A woman whose bones, he now understood with growing horror, he was about to find after centuries of forced separation. And she was not alone. None of them were. The interior of the Church of St. Francis breathed death, with the ease of a cemetery disguised as a holy place. Every step Cleide and Joceir took echoed through the naves like the heartbeats of a gigantic heart buried beneath the altar stones. The walls, covered in centuries of prayers and tears, seemed to pulse with a life of their own, as if absorbing not only the moisture from the air, but also the last breaths of all those who had met their end there. Cleide Santos was not an easily intimidated woman. In her 59 years, she had built an empire in the sewing business, facing hostile markets and unfair competition, with the iron determination of someone who learned that the world offers nothing for free. Her fingers, calloused from decades of handling needles and fabrics, had always known how to find the exact point where fibers joined or unraveled. But here, in this church, she felt as if her own fibers were being tested by forces she did not understand. She had developed her passion for historical places after her husband's death 5 years ago. Cancer had taken Eduardo in 6 brutal months, and Cleide discovered that visiting sites where time had left its deepest marks helped her process her grief. Every ruin, every cathedral, every castle carried stories of people who had also lost those they loved. It was comforting to know that her pain was not exclusively hers, but the Church of St. Francis carried a different kind of pain, a pain that did not console, it infected. Joceir Mendes observed every architectural detail with an attention that went beyond tourist curiosity. His analytical mind, sharpened by decades of commanding companies and making decisions that moved millions, registered inconsistencies he couldn't explain. Why were certain stones darker than others? Why did the air circulate strangely near the altar? Why wouldn't his hands stop sweating despite the cold emanating from the walls? The truth was that Joceir had lied to Cleide about the reasons for the trip. It wasn't just historical interest that had brought him to Évora. It was an obsession that had been growing in his mind for months, fed by disturbing dreams in which a woman in ancient clothing called to him in archaic Portuguese, imploring him to bring back what was taken. In the dreams, she always pointed to her own bones, scattered on the floor like pieces of a macabre puzzle he needed to solve. The genealogical research he had commissioned the previous year had revealed information he would rather not have discovered. The Mendes family had deep roots in Portugal, dating back to the 16th century. His great-great-grandmother, Maria Fernanda Mendes, had been accused of witchcraft in 1587 and executed at the stake in the public square. What the documents didn't say explicitly, but suggested through veiled references, was that her body had been exhumed years later when the church decided to create the macabre decoration of the Chapel of Bones. The tour guide, who had introduced himself only as Manuel, walked ahead of them with steps that produced no echo, a strange detail Cleide noticed only subconsciously. His explanations about the church's history flowed like a memorized recitation, but there were strategic pauses, moments where his eyes sought Joceir's as if searching for recognition, as if he knew exactly who he was and why he had come. The Chapel of Bones was built in the 16th century by 3 Franciscan monks, Manuel explained, his voice echoing strangely in the stone vaults. They wanted to create a space for reflection on mortality, a visual reminder that we all shall return to dust. He paused, fixing his eyes on Joceir, but they used the bones of people who died under special circumstances, people whose souls may not have been at peace when they departed. Cleide felt a cold chill run down her spine. There was something in the way Manuel pronounced special that sounded like cursed. She adjusted her camera, not noticing that the digital display was already showing blurs moving in the shadows, even when no one was walking in that direction. The temperature inside the church began to drop gradually. It wasn't a dramatic change, but a constant one, as if each step toward the Chapel of Bones brought them closer to an eternal winter. Joceir felt a growing pressure in his chest, as if the air were getting thicker with each breath. His temples throbbed with a rhythm that didn't match his heartbeat. When they finally reached the entrance to the Chapel of Bones, Cleide stopped abruptly. Through the half-open door, she could see the walls lined with human skulls and bones, arranged in geometric patterns that seemed hypnotic. But there was something else. A low, almost inaudible murmur, as if hundreds of voices were whispering in unison. Whispers in a language she didn't recognize, but that her stomach interpreted as threats. Joceir took a step toward the entrance and froze. For a moment, just for a moment, he was absolutely certain that someone had whispered his name from inside the chapel. Not Joceir in modern Portuguese, but something older, more intimate. A name that only someone from his family, someone who had known him since before birth, could use. And when he looked through the doorway, between the rows of empty skulls, he had the disturbing impression that one of them had winked. Entering the Chapel of Bones was like crossing the membrane between worlds. The air changed instantly, not just the temperature, which plummeted to levels that gave you goosebumps, but the very density of the atmosphere became viscous, as if they were breathing through a mist made of the size of the dead. Cleide felt her lungs contract, not from a lack of oxygen, but as if the air carried liquid memories of last breaths that refused to fully disperse. The chapel was smaller than they expected, but its smallness amplified the horror rather than diminishing it. Entire walls lined with human skulls and bones created hypnotic geometric patterns, circles of skulls interspersed with femurs arranged like the rays of a macabre sun. Spinal columns snaking between humeri like bone serpents, petrified in the midst of a deathly dance. More than 5,000 bodies had been dismantled to create this morbid decoration, and every bone seemed to vibrate with a residual energy that made the air tremble almost imperceptibly. Cleide raised the camera with hands that shook more than she would like to admit. Through the digital viewfinder, the chapel looked even more sinister, as if modern technology could capture frequencies of light that the human eye filtered out by instinct for self-preservation. She snapped the first photo, and the flash momentarily lit up the entire chapel with a cruel, white light that tore shadows from the darkest corners and cast them on the walls like dancing figures. It was then that Joceir heard his name whispered for the first time, with absolute clarity. It wasn't his imagination, not the wind circulating among the bones. It was a female voice, laden with a perverse sweetness that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up like antennae picking up signals from another dimension. Joceir, my blood. Finally, the voice seemed to come from all the skulls at once, as if 5,000 dead mouths were articulating the same word in unison. Manuel, the guide, watched Joceir's reaction with an attention that went beyond professional. His eyes shone with a secret knowledge, as if he were an accomplice to forces that had operated in this place for centuries. Many people report unusual experiences here, he said, his voice low like a confession, especially those who have ancestral connections to the exposed bones. It's as if the dead recognize the blood of the living who carry their memories. Cleide continued taking pictures, driven by a compulsion she couldn't explain. It was as if the camera had a will of its own, aiming at specific angles without her consciously choosing them. When she paused to review the first images, she felt her stomach churn, as if she had swallowed liquid metal. The photos showed details she hadn't noticed with the naked eye. Shadows that moved independently of their sources, reflections in eye sockets that should have been empty, and in one specific image, a translucent figure pointing directly at Joceir. The figure in the photo was undoubtedly female, dressed in clothes reminiscent of the 16th century, and her face was of a disturbing beauty, preserved in an expression of supplication that turned into a threat, depending on the angle of observation. Her facial features were refined, aristocratic, but there was something in her eyes, even as just a digital image, that conveyed an ancestral hunger that made Cleide want to delete the photo immediately and forget it ever existed. Joceir moved closer to see the image and paled until his lips were the color of ancient bone. That face was identical to a miniature he had kept for decades, a portrait of his great-great-grandmother that his own grandmother had given him before she died, whispering that it was important to keep the memory of those who died unjustly. At the time, he had dismissed it as family drama. Now he understood it was a warning. The chapel began to echo with sounds that weren't exactly whispers, but weren't silence either. It was as if hundreds of very slow breaths were synchronizing in a rhythm that didn't correspond to any living heart. The sound created a subsonic vibration that made the bones on the walls tremble almost imperceptibly. A resonance felt more than heard. Manuel approached them with steps that made no sound at all, a detail Cleide finally noticed consciously, and which made her skin crawl as if thousands of ants were marching beneath her epidermis. "You can feel it, can't you?" he asked, his voice carrying a grim satisfaction. "The dead who do not rest in peace never forget those who owe them acknowledgement or reparation." Joceir felt an icy hand touch the back of his neck, long, cold fingers that seemed made of condensed air, caressing his skin with a familiarity that made him realize, with growing horror, that this was not the first time this presence had touched him. She had been with him his whole life, watching, waiting, awaiting the exact moment he would return to the place where her bones lay desecrated as a holy ornament. When he turned around, there was no one behind him, but on the floor, upon the centuries-old dust that covered the ancient stones, a woman's footprints were forming, one after another, as if someone invisible were walking in circles around him. Footprints that led to a specific section of the wall where the skulls seemed to smile with a malice that transcended simple bone decay. And it was then that Joceir understood, with a clarity that made his sanity falter, that his great-great-grandmother was not alone. None of the bones in that chapel belonged to people who had died in peace. The footprints on the floor continued to form, one after another, drawing a perfect circle around Joceir as if he were the center of a ritual that had begun centuries before his birth. The ancient dust moved on its own, creating the impressions of bare feet that were too small to belong to an adult, yet carried the weight of a presence that made the very air vibrate with supernatural tension. Cleide watched, hypnotized, her camera automatically recording each ghostly footprint as it materialized on the stone floor. The temperature in the chapel had plummeted to levels that defied rational explanation. Their breaths came out in dense clouds of vapor that didn't disperse normally. Instead, they hung in the air like phantoms of breath, forming vague shapes that resembled faces contorted in agony. Joceir felt his fingers growing numb, not just from the cold, but from a creeping numbness that started at his fingertips and spread up his arms, as if something invisible were draining the vital warmth from his body. Manuel remained motionless near the entrance, his eyes fixed on Joceir with an intensity that transcended professional curiosity. There was recognition in his gaze, as if he knew exactly what was about to happen. "Your family has a very old debt with this place," he said, his voice echoing strangely among the bones on the walls. "Some debts are paid in life. Others are inherited through the blood and collected when the debtor finally returns to the place of origin." It was then that Cleide noticed something disturbing in her most recent photographs. In each image, more spectral figures appeared. It wasn't just the woman pointing at Joceir. There were other presences, dozens of them, emerging from the shadows between the bones like toxic vapors taking humanoid form. Men, women, even children, all wearing clothes from centuries past, all with expressions that mixed supplication and a thirst for revenge in stomach-turning proportions. Joceir began to hear the voices more clearly now. It was no longer just an isolated whisper, but a cacophony of laments that overlapped like layers of accumulated pain. Voices in archaic Portuguese, others in Latin, some in languages he couldn't identify but that his blood recognized with primal terror. They all repeated variations of the same message. Son of our blood, why have you abandoned us? Why did you allow our bones to be desecrated? The truth was crystallizing in his mind like poison, turning into revelation. The genealogical documents he had researched told only part of the story. His family wasn't just descended from Maria Fernanda Mendes. They were descended from an entire lineage that had been systematically persecuted and executed during the Portuguese Inquisition. Accusations of heresy, witchcraft, demonic pacts, all fabricated to justify the confiscation of lands and riches the family had accumulated over generations. The bones in the chapel didn't just belong to criminals or the indigent poor. They belonged to his family. Dozens of his ancestors had been executed, their bodies desecrated, their bones torn from consecrated graves to serve as macabre decorations in a church that fed on their posthumous humiliation. And now, after centuries of being forgotten, the last descendant had returned. The manifestations intensified, as if his realization were a supernatural catalyst. The skulls on the walls began to move their jaws in sync, producing a grinding sound of bone that turned into intelligible murmurs. Through the camera's viewfinder, Cleide saw the empty eye sockets of some skulls glowing with a phosphorescent light that had no identifiable physical source. Joceir felt invisible hands touching his body, not just one but dozens of them, spectral fingers caressing his arms, his face, his chest, with an intimate familiarity that made him understand that these presences had known him since before he was born. They had been with him his entire life, watching, waiting, preparing for this moment of mutual recognition. The strongest presence, the one he now knew to be his great-great-grandmother Maria Fernanda, partially materialized before him. It was not a full apparition, but a concentration of energy that distorted the air, like heat rising from molten asphalt. Through this distortion, he could make out the contours of a woman's face of aristocratic beauty, preserved in an expression that mixed ancestral love with vengeful hunger. "My precious blood," the voice whispered directly into his mind, bypassing his ears entirely. "You have finally returned to free us from this eternal desecration. Our bones have cried out for a worthy rest for 400 years. Our spirits have waited in agony for someone of our lineage to come and right this injustice." Cleide tried to back away toward the exit, but found that her legs wouldn't obey her commands. It was as if invisible roots had sprouted from the stone floor and tangled around her ankles, holding her captive as a mandatory witness to what was about to unfold. Manuel discreetly blocked the exit, his smile revealing teeth that seemed sharper than they should be. "Some family reunions," he said with a dark satisfaction that made Cleide realize he was no mere tour guide, "take centuries to arrange properly." The revelation about Manuel hit Cleide like a physical blow to the stomach. Watching him more closely now, she noticed details her mind had filtered out for self-preservation. He cast no shadow on the stone floor, despite the chapel's artificial lighting. His breath produced no vapor in the frigid air that made their teeth chatter involuntarily. And when he smiled, there was something fundamentally wrong with the way his lips curved, as if it were an imperfect imitation of a human smile performed by something that had forgotten how joy actually worked. "Who are you?" Cleide managed to whisper, her voice coming out strangled as if invisible cords were tightening around her throat. Manuel tilted his head with a movement reminiscent of canine curiosity, but his eyes remained fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin tingle, as if thousands of insects were crawling beneath her epidermis. "I am merely a facilitator," he replied, his voice taking on impossible harmonic overtones as if multiple people were speaking through his mouth simultaneously. "Someone who ensures that certain family reunions happen at the appropriate time. This place has many guardians, Cleide Santos. Not all of them are visible to the eyes of the living." Joceir was now completely surrounded by the spectral presences. What had begun as isolated whispers had transformed into a cacophony of ancestral voices, overlapping in layers of lament and supplication. Through the supernatural mist distorting the air around him, he could distinguish dozens of figures. Men with long beards dressed as medieval merchants, women in hoods hiding faces scarred by torture, children whose eyes shone with a disturbing wisdom that transcended their apparent age. They were all from the Mendes family. All had been executed by the Inquisition. All had had their bodies desecrated to serve as macabre ornaments in that chapel, which fed on their eternal humiliation. Maria Fernanda's presence gradually solidified, gaining density like smoke, condensing into mist, and then into an almost tangible substance. Joceir could now see the details of her face, aristocratic features preserved in a beauty that death had transformed into something simultaneously sublime and terrifying. Her eyes were pools of ancient sadness that glowed with a light that came from no source. "My dear great-grandson," she said, her voice echoing not just in the air, but directly in Joceir's bones, making them vibrate like tuning forks set to supernatural frequencies. "How many nights I have spent watching you grow, whispering your name as you slept, awaiting the moment you would be strong enough to return and repair our humiliation." Cleide felt a wave of primal panic as she realized she had been brought there not as a tourist, but as a witness. Her compulsion for historical places, her inexplicable attraction to sites where death had left deep marks, it had all been orchestrated to lead her to this specific moment. She was the mandatory audience for a spectacle that had been rehearsed for centuries. She tried again to move toward the exit, but her legs responded as if submerged in invisible molasses. The air around her had become as thick as liquid, charged with an energy that made every movement require superhuman effort. Manuel watched her attempts to escape with genuine amusement, like a child watching an insect caught in a spider's web. The manifestations intensified exponentially. The bones on the walls began to rearrange themselves, skulls turning to fix their empty eye sockets on Joceir, femurs and tibias moving like bone serpents slithering through the mortar joints. The sound was deafening, not just the grinding of ancient bones, but groans that seemed to come from the very stones of the church, as if the entire building were a living organism, slowly digesting its accumulated pain. Joceir began to bleed from his nostrils for no apparent reason. Scarlet drops dripped onto the stone floor, and where his blood touched the ancient dust, small spectral plants sprouted, translucent flowers that exuded a perfume of tombs and burnt incense. It was as if his life essence was being siphoned to feed the growing materialization of his dead ancestors. "Blood recognizes blood," murmured Maria Fernanda, her form gaining more solidity with each falling drop. "Our bones drank from the consecrated earth for 400 years, absorbing prayers and tears until they became more than mere calcium. We are living reliquaries, my dear great-grandson. And now that you have returned, we can finally complete the transformation." The other presences began to materialize as well, feeding on the ancestral blood Joceir was involuntarily offering. The chapel filled with increasingly solid spectral figures, each bearing the marks of their execution: broken necks, burns from the stake, torture wounds that continued to bleed a phosphorescent substance that dripped onto the floor like sacred oil. Cleide understood, with a clarity that made her sanity tremble, that they didn't just want recognition or reparation, they wanted a transfer. They wanted to trade places with the living, to use Joceir's blood as a bridge between worlds to finally escape their bony prison. And Manuel, Manuel was there to ensure the transaction was completed regardless of the consent of those involved. The chapel echoed with spectral laughter that sounded like glass shattering in slow motion, and Cleide realized her camera had stopped working. The screen showed only static, but through the electronic hiss, voices whispered in agreement. "Welcome to the family, blood of our blood. Welcome to eternal rest." Joceir's blood had become a continuous font, fueling the materialization of the dead, and with every drop that touched the consecrated ground, the spectral presences gained more substance, more power, more hunger. Cleide watched in horror as her friend's skin grew progressively paler, not just from the supernatural cold, but as if his very life essence were being drained through invisible tubes connecting his veins to the empty sockets of the skulls on the walls. Maria Fernanda now possessed an almost complete solidity, her aristocratic beauty preserved in a perfection that death had transformed into something hypnotically terrifying. When she moved, she left trails of phosphorescent light in the air, as if she were made of concentrated energy leaking through the cracks of reality. Her eyes fixed on Joceir's with a maternal intensity that carried centuries of repressed love and vengeful thirst in proportions that made sanity waver. "The time for reparation has come, my precious blood," she whispered, her words echoing not only in the air, but directly in Joceir's bone marrow. "For 400 years, our spirits have remained trapped in these desecrated bones, serving as decoration for those who unjustly executed us. But blood calls to blood, and the last of our lineage has finally returned to set us free." Joceir tried to back away, but his legs no longer fully obeyed his commands. It was as if spectral roots had sprouted from the stone floor and entwined his limbs, holding him motionless at the center of the circle formed by his dead ancestors. His voice came out as a strangled groan when he tried to speak. What do you want from me?" The answer came not just from Maria Fernanda, but from all the presences simultaneously, their voices overlapping in a macabre harmony that made the bones on the walls vibrate like musical instruments tuned to supernatural frequencies. "We want to live again. We want to feel blood rushing through human veins. We want to breathe, to cry, to love. Through your body with your life, using your flesh as the vessel for our resurrection." Cleide understood with growing horror that she was witnessing not just a paranormal manifestation, but a ritual of collective possession. The dead didn't just want recognition. They wanted a complete transfer, to use Joceir as a host for dozens of vengeful souls who would turn his body into a spiritual colony where each ancestor could experience life again through his flesh. Manuel approached her with soundless steps, his eyes now glowing with the same phosphorescent light that emanated from the materialized spirits. "You have had the privilege of witnessing a family reunion that took centuries to arrange," he said, his voice taking on impossible harmonics that made Cleide's eardrums ache. "Few living mortals witness the exact moment when death reclaims what is owed to it by right of blood." Cleide felt a supernatural force pushing her closer to the circle where Joceir was being prepared for the ritual. Her legs moved against her will, as if invisible strings controlled them like a marionette. "Why me?" she managed to ask, her voice a desperate whisper. "Because every transfer requires a witness," Manuel replied with a smile that revealed teeth that had grown sharp as blades. "And because your morbid curiosity for places where death has left its mark has made you sensitive to spectral frequencies. You are a living antenna for the supernatural, Cleide Santos. Your presence amplifies our ability to interact with the world of the living." The spirits began to form an orderly queue, as if awaiting their turn to enter Joceir's body. Maria Fernanda would be first, of course. The right of the firstborn transcended death. But there were dozens of others waiting patiently. Merchants executed for alleged demonic pacts, women burned for heresy, children killed simply for bearing the cursed surname. Joceir felt his consciousness begin to fragment, as if his mind were a stained glass window being methodically shattered, piece by piece. Ancestral voices whispered in his head, memories that were not his own, overlaid his own recollections, and he could feel his personality being gradually dissolved to make room for the spectral tenants who had waited centuries for this opportunity. There is still a chance. A different voice whispered in Cleide's mind, not a threatening voice like the others, but something gentle, familiar. It was Eduardo, her dead husband. The ritual can be stopped, but only with an equivalent sacrifice. A life voluntarily offered can break the ancestral chain that binds them to this place. Cleide looked around desperately, searching for anything she could use to stop what was happening. But Manuel watched her every move with predatory attention, and the materialized spirits formed an impenetrable barrier around Joceir. Maria Fernanda extended her hands toward her great-grandson's face, her spectral fingers nearing his temples, as if to bless him before possessing him completely. Do not resist, my dear blood. The fusion will be less painful if you allow it to happen naturally. Your ancestors know how to care for obedient descendants. And it was in that moment, when all seemed lost, that Cleide realized the one thing Manuel had underestimated. Her camera had stopped working normally, but the battery was still charged, and a camera flash she would discover in seconds had a devastating effect on spirits that had just materialized using stolen energy from the living. Her hand found the flash button at the exact moment Maria Fernanda touched Joceir's face, and the sound of the flash echoed through the chapel like a cannon shot in a silent cathedral. The cruel, white light exploded through the chapel like a luminous grenade, and the spectral screams that followed would wake Cleide from nightmares for the next 20 years of her life. The flash exploded through the chapel like a miniature supernova, and the effects were instantaneous and devastating. The materialized spirits didn't just recoil, they partially disintegrated, their solid forms fragmenting into thousands of phosphorescent particles that danced in the air like luminous ash. The screams that echoed off the walls were not just of pain, but of an ancestral fury that had been interrupted at the most crucial moment of its resurrection. Maria Fernanda let out a shriek that cracked the bones on the walls, a sound that combined maternal lament with homicidal thirst, at frequencies that made eardrums bleed. Her beautiful, aristocratic form contorted grotesquely, revealing beneath the mask of preserved nobility something far more ancient and hungry. A core of energy that had fed on hatred and resentment for 400 years until it had become something that transcended any human conception of vengeance. "You dare interrupt our sacred reunion?" she roared, her voice echoing not just in the chapel but seemingly across parallel dimensions. "You dare deny the dead what is owed to them by right of blood and suffering?" Joceir collapsed to the floor, temporarily freed from the spectral chains that held him. But the possession process had begun and left irreversible marks. His pupils flickered between their natural brown and a milky white that glowed with its own light, as if multiple consciousnesses were fighting for control of his eyes. When he spoke, his voice came out as a discordant harmony. "Cleide, run. They're inside me, whispering." So many voices. But Cleide couldn't run. Manuel had transformed into something that revealed his true nature. Not a tour guide or even a guardian spirit, but an ancestral devourer that fed on the life force released during possession rituals. His human form melted away like hot wax, revealing beneath it a creature made of condensed shadows and ancient hunger, with eyes that were black holes in the fabric of reality. "You don't understand what you've done," the Manuel thing hissed, its voice now a cacophony of whispers coming from all directions at once. "These spirits aren't just lost souls seeking peace, they are fuel. They are the concentrated energy that maintains the barriers between worlds. And you have just shattered the balance that took centuries to establish." The flash had acted as a key, unlocking doors that should have remained sealed forever. The bones on the walls began to glow with a radioactive light that shouldn't exist in the visible spectrum. And through the crevices between the skulls, other things began to emerge. Entities that were not and had never been human. Dimensional predators that had been trapped on the other side, waiting for a breach in the spiritual barrier to infiltrate the world of the living. Cleide understood with absolute horror that the spirits of the Mendes family were not the true prisoners of the chapel. They were the guardians. Their souls, bound to the bones, functioned as a supernatural prison, keeping something far worse encapsulated between dimensions. And her attempt to save Joceir had unleashed horrors that would make the Inquisition look like child's play. The creatures emerging from the spaces between the bones had no fixed form. They were amalgams of translucent tentacles, mouths full of crystalline teeth, and eyes that were portals to cosmic voids where sanity went to die. They moved through the air as if it were liquid, producing sounds that were anti-music, frequencies that unraveled the molecular cohesion of the reality around them. Maria Fernanda partially reformed, but now her beauty was replaced by a terrifying majesty. "Do you see what you have wrought, ignorant mortal?" she said, pointing to the abominations pouring through the dimensional rifts. "For centuries our family has served as the lock and key to this prison. Our eternal suffering was the price paid to keep these entities from your world. And now..." Joceir rose from the floor, but he was no longer Joceir. Multiple consciousnesses inhabited his body simultaneously, each dead ancestor commanding different parts of his anatomy. His right hand moved with the elegance of an aristocratic lady, while his left gestured with the brutality of a medieval merchant. His eyes flickered through different personalities every second, and when he spoke, dozens of voices poured from his throat in a desperate unison. The breach must be repaired before they consume everything. The fusion wasn't possession. It was a necessity. We were the only ones who could keep them trapped. One of the interdimensional creatures materialized completely, its grotesque mass filling half the chapel. It was larger than any terrestrial animal, made of a substance that looked like liquid glass mixed with crystallized nightmares. When it moved, reality warped around it like tearing fabric, and the sound it produced was like the birth scream of the universe itself being played in reverse. Cleide understood there was only one way to reverse what she had done, one way to restore the balance and reseal the dimensional prison. But the price would be her own life, offered voluntarily to replace the spiritual energy she had scattered with the flash. The Manuel thing approached her with tendrils of shadow that extended like hungry fingers. "Now do you understand, little mortal? Now do you comprehend that some horrors exist out of necessity, not malice? Your morbid curiosity brought you here to witness the end of your world." The interdimensional creature emitted a roar that made the church stones bleed, a phosphorescent substance that smelled of dead stars and extinct civilizations. More creatures continued to emerge from the rifts, each more grotesque and impossible than the last. And it was then that Cleide Santos, the seamstress-turned-businesswoman who always knew how to join separate fibers, understood exactly how to mend the fabric of reality she had torn, even if it cost her everything. Cleide looked at the camera in her trembling hands and understood that the flash had only been the catalyst. The true key to restoring balance lay in the very technology that had documented the entire sequence of supernatural events. The photographs she had captured weren't just images. They were fragments of the soul of every spirit that had been digitally recorded. And if she could reverse the process, "The light that scatters can also gather," she whispered, remembering her dead husband's words. With fingers that trembled like leaves in a storm, she began to systematically delete every photograph she had taken, starting with the last and moving backward chronologically. With each deleted image, one of the interdimensional creatures was sucked back into the rifts between the bones, as if it were made of pixels returning to a digital void. The Manuel thing roared with understanding and fury, extending shadowy tendrils toward the camera, but Maria Fernanda intercepted the attack. "She understands," the spectral matriarch said, her voice filled with a resignation that transcended centuries. "The mortal understands the price of forbidden knowledge." With each deleted photograph, Joceir reclaimed fragments of his own consciousness, but the process of collective possession had left permanent scars on his psyche. He would never be completely himself again. He would always carry the echoes of ancestral voices whispering in his mind. memories not his own overlaying his recollections like the ghosts of others' experiences. When Cleide reached the first photograph, the one showing Maria Fernanda pointing directly at Joceir, she hesitated for a moment that felt like an eternity. Deleting that image would mean erasing the only proof that her experience had actually happened. It would mean returning to the normal world, bearing alone the weight of truths no one would believe. "Do it," Joceir whispered in his own voice, finally free of the spectral influences. "Some truths are too heavy to be shared." Cleide's finger pressed the delete button. The spiritual implosion that followed was silent, but devastating. The interdimensional creatures were sucked back into their dimensional prisons like water down a cosmic drain. The spirits of the Mendes family faded gradually, returning to their role as eternal guardians, but not before Maria Fernanda whispered one last message directly into Joceir's mind. "Remember us, blood of our blood. Remember that our suffering has a purpose." The Manuel thing was the last to vanish, its form dissolving like toxic smoke returning to the church stones. Its final words echoed like a prophecy. "Others will come, other curious ones who do not respect the boundaries between worlds, and when they come, we will be waiting." The silence that followed was absolute, not the absence of sound, but the presence of a void that made the ears ring with phantom echoes. The chapel's temperature gradually returned to normal, but neither Cleide nor Joceir would feel true warmth for weeks to come. They left the Church of St. Francis in silence, walking like war survivors who shared traumas that transcended words. The courtyard of uneven stones looked normal under the Portuguese sun, but they both knew they could never again look at ancient architecture without wondering what horrors might lie dormant beneath the layers of history and tradition. In the months that followed, Cleide developed an inexplicable aversion to mirrors and reflective surfaces. Joceir never visited historical sites again, but began having dreams where he walked through infinite corridors lined with bones that whispered their gratitude in archaic Portuguese. Both reported seeing peripheral visions of figures in medieval clothing, always at the edge of their vision, always vanishing when looked at directly. Later research revealed that the Church of St. Francis had records of dozens of similar incidents over the centuries. Visitors who entered the Chapel of Bones and left transformed, carrying knowledge they shouldn't possess about families dead for generations. But the records always ended the same way. The incidents were filed as mystical experiences and quickly forgotten by the ecclesiastical authorities. Today, the Chapel of Bones continues to welcome thousands of tourists annually. The phrase at the entrance remains as a warning few take seriously. "We bones that are here, for yours, we wait." But some sensitive visitors report strange sensations. The feeling of being watched by empty eye sockets, whispers in ancient languages when they are alone in the chapel, and photographs that show presences that were not visible when the picture was taken. Cleide and Joceir returned to Brazil, carrying the weight of a disturbing truth. Some places are not just historic or sacred. They are necessary prisons where spectral guardians keep interdimensional horrors at bay from the world of the living. And human curiosity, however innocent it may seem, can be the key that unleashes monsters that would make humanity beg for the return of blessed ignorance. The question that haunts them every night is simple and terrifying. How many other historic sites around the world serve as similar prisons? How many other cursed families eternally fulfill the role of guardians to keep humanity safe from truths that would destroy entire civilizations? And when other curious people inevitably find these places, will they have the wisdom to respect the dead who suffer to protect the living? Some questions Cleide and Joceir learned are more frightening than any answer. In the Church of St. Francis, among the 5,000 skulls that decorate the sacred walls, 2 pairs of empty eye sockets occasionally glow with spectral gratitude when the moon is full. Maria Fernanda Mendes and her family continue their eternal vigil, involuntary guardians of horrors that wait patiently in the shadows between dimensions, whispering to anyone who will listen, "We bones that are here, for yours we wait and protect." The echo remains, forever. Dread portal, where some truths are too heavy to be forgotten, yet too necessary to be ignored. Thanks for crossing this dark night with us on the Dread portal. Now tell me, would you have the courage to go through this? Share in the comments, if you can sleep tonight. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to get more chilling stories every week. Sleep well, if you can, until the next story. Good night, and until the next video from the Dread portal.